The poison was still running its course. Jeremy's limp head and dark brown kinks were magnetized rough to the greyhound headrest. The faint, hollow rhythm of his breath kept getting broken up by the intermittent rumbling. The bus had been unlighted for a long stretch. It was now nearly 8 hours since he had abandoned his boys, the major sin so far in his short and happy life. And when a loud, hulking crash jolted him fully awake and into the darkness, it seemed that universal justice had finally caught up to him as well. His body was still recovering slowly from the night before. Jeremy looked out ahead. He saw nothing but rows of majestic, prismatic colors, reds, yellows, and blues of all variations and permutations, folding endlessly over themselves in his peripheral vision. He assumed this was it. Linear time still felt like sprinting through a sea of molasses, and before he had a chance to slap or shake himself, he was blinded by the onrush of sudden light. A voice that seemed too harsh to be God's spoke through the brightness, piercing the shallow redness of his eyelids, telling of last stops and thank you for writings. Why couldn't God just speak plainly, he thought. Why the fuck were the riddles necessary? That's why people don't believe, he grumbled in his head. Nothing could be said straight up. Jeremy didn't have to puzzle it for long. The man next to him, bald on top, along with a hefty square beard of barbed reddish hair, nudged Michelle in the bicep with the slightest aftertaste of disgust in his low voice. Come on, buddy. I've got a meeting to get to. Let's go, please. The Greyhound bus had just pulled into Port Authority, its final destination. He was home. His first conscious sensation was relief, immediate and incredulous. It lasted for less than 30 seconds. This was the first sustained rest he'd gotten since last night. Somehow he was still alive. It seemed like he'd made it after all. Made it. His thought, even though his body was still enveloped in that now terrifying silkworm numbness, had at least brought the concept of guilt back to him. But it was only a distant abstraction, locked behind some sophisticated glass case near the horizon of his imagination, a feeling to be gazed at curiously. Jeremy flexed his syrupy shoulders, feeling like they belonged to someone else, and rose from his seat. The low ceiling forced him to crane his neck and torso into an unnatural curve. He waited for the slow clog of people in the aisle to ease, then brought down his backpack from the overhead bin. The passengers around him slid about in their spring jackets and blue skull caps, holding up their worn faces with the little passion left still animating their tired blood. Another flood of light met him while passing the automatic doors into the terminal. He shaded his squinting eyes. There were hundreds of blurred faces, rushing directionless across the huge lobby like gray wandering apparitions. Some were in the desperate, nostalgic clutch of friends and family united after a long time, drunk in a cacophony of hugs and smiles and laughing tears. The less lucky lay prone on the cold tiled floor, using their luggage as pillows. He grabbed his suitcase and backpack stuffed with notebooks full of rhymes and tones on hip-hop history, stolen from the university library, through this deluge, nodding to those he made accidental eye contact with, and shuffled into the public bathroom. When he went to wash his hands, a jumpy young guy in a black bomber 2 sizes too big stared at him through the wide sink mirror. His hands were broken with ash. A drooping lower lip revealed a set of rusted, decayed teeth. Jeremy splashed his face and looked at his own reflection. His pupils were still restricted to monstrous needlepoints. Only his hazel irises seemed to be left. He dried himself with the underside of his white t-shirt and left quickly. Port Authority is an unusual place. It pulses with liminality, smudged with the traces of those who stay for a short while and then might never return. Jeremy himself, in aberration, had recycled to this place and performed its rituals many times, perhaps 15 to 20, and found a groove so mechanical he could keep any serious thinking to a minimum. Much, much later, he made the educated guess that the batch of LSD they took was probably cut with fentanyl, since that was one of the only opioids strong enough to kill a man and still fit on those tiny paper tabs the acid came on. Why it was spiked, for what psychopathic reason would one do that, he never would find out for sure, and spent many late hours in his room, despondent, inebriated, facing the wall, silently asking unknown gods for the answer, straining into the silence for a response. Connected to the Port Authority, underneath Times Square's demented neon brilliance, lies a tunnel whose narrowness and length gives the impression that it extends infinitely. Trendy minimalist ads line the walls, and stamped onto the ancient ceiling beams are 8 fragments of phrases that build as you continue down. Most people, including Jeremy, ignore the words on their commutes, possessed by the manic flash of their smartphones. But if you pay attention from the entrance and read along, you'll discover the unfolding of a dark and curt urban poem, implicating your life and the lives of everyone going down that tunnel alongside you in its sardonic prophecy. Turn to prose, the poem goes like this. Overslept, so tired. If late, get fired. Why bother? Why the pain? Just go home, do it again. It was only when he threw his luggage over the turnstile and crossed over from the Port Authority into the subway system that highly particular New York smell, recognizable to anyone who's been here, washed over him. It's a difficult sensation to name. He got the same influx when he would come back from a summer vacation in Haiti, before the earthquake had cracked the island open and changed everything. Just as when stepping out onto the tarmac at Port-au-Prince, one is blasted with a gust of swampy heat, mixed with the smell of aged rum and dried palm leaves, coming into the city offers an olfactory experience that reaches into the bones and lets your body know you've returned before your mind catches up. That particular smell is somewhere between piss, fresh garbage, fried meat, soap, and an assortment of ingredients too subtle to name. Mixed together, their announcement to the senses is blunt. Welcome back. Abroad through the shifting veils of the crowd, a small man sitting on an aluminum fold-out chair was playing an air hoop. Jeremy stared at him for what felt like 10 minutes. The old man, with a clean-shaven, wrinkled head and slightly trembling hands, was seducing such nostalgic and sorrowful music from those two strings that it felt absurd for him to be leaning against a column begging for change down there in the belly of the beast. He worked simply and gracefully, straining for nothing. The sound of the man spilling his soul through those strings seemed to cleanse the atmosphere. Jeremy kept walking, wishing he had at least a quarter to give, if only as a token of recognition, then reprimanded that impulse as patronizing arrogance. Passing the musician, Michel turned into the infinite tunnel with his small army of luggage. He took a long breath, stretched his neck to the side, and began trudging along with the rest. Maybe it was the weight of his belongings or a trick of his still recovering eyes, but the tunnel seemed even more illuminated and endless than usual. He looked up to see if they had changed the light, and saw, overslept. This, he felt, definitely did not apply to him. And by the way, if I go over, you just tell me and I'll, Jeremy had met Kenny at freshman orientation, where they sat next to each other on creaky maroon fold-out chairs, listening to an advisor preach the hidden virtues of college life on Commonwealth Avenue. And they met Daniel through Kenny a few months later. At first, it seemed to him unlikely that those two would be his friends. Kenny was stilted at times in his short and stocky frame, thoughtful and analytical, but Daniel ricocheted against the walls of every room he entered, drawing eyes to himself like a vaudevillian forever on stage. Daniel was tall, firmly built from many seasons of club soccer, and of the opinion that these 4 years were for making a grand fool of himself before the weight of the world pressed him into a more reasonably conventional shape. His social contagiousness was responsible for securing the acid plug. They spent 3 weeks researching potentiates, interactions, and contraindications before buying their first strip of tabs. Jeremy had never met the plug, nor thought to ask for an identity, so attempting to find him later was impossible. After a few moments of struggle in the tunnel, he spotted the woman. The stumbling lady seemed to pop directly out of one of those old Hanna-Barbera cartoons. Her head, torso, and bottom filled the outline of 3 progressively larger ovals. She wore a deep violet blouse, oversized blue denim jeans, and scuffed white running shoes. Her hair was casually brought up in a bun. Her back was turned to him. She was obviously also struggling with her own luggage, yanking a brown leather suitcase forward in short bursts with one hand, while the other 2 held stuffed tote bags beneath a purse wedged under her armpit. Although her frustration was clear from yards away, no one came to her aid. The school of city fish just formed a current around her. Underneath the light, more potent with every step, she made a pathetic scene. But for some reason, the intensity of the violet on her blouse drew him, as if the pure power of the color called him towards it. Kenny was splayed out in a 3/4 snow angel pose, more like a double arrow, on the dirty silver carpet under cheap LED lights, sinking into bliss, saying, "You better give the plug a fucking tip next time," he laughed. "What the fuck, man? This shit is straight from the lab, son. I mean, seriously, what the fuck?" For the past 5 months, the 3 had always tripped at Kenny's place since he added to himself for that semester. The roommate was studying abroad or on medical leave, it depended on who you asked. Daniel agreed, chuckling in a high, short pitch, sprawled out on the leather lounging chair, his head pressed into the cushion, running his hands through his hair. "Not bad this time, not at all," he nodded to himself. "I'll think about it." He shook his arms to feel the vibration in his muscles. It was still light out when they started. Even now in May, the weather was so icy and windy and wet that they had decided to keep the experience indoors. This was fine by them. Watching the Arctic New England breeze whirl past the narrow window from the warmth and coziness of a college apartment was a paradox that always provided laughs during a trip. This was beyond the 8th time in 6 months. Each experimental session returned incredible results. By the end of every new round, it felt as if they were left with a deeper and more lasting sense of entitlement than the last. Enlightenment, but I said entitlement, which is a Freudian slip right there. Jeremy was silent, laying on his back on the sofa, a stupid grin plastered over his olive face. Ambling by the wall of the tunnel, the violet of the lady's blouse kept pulling him, but he steeled himself, enjoying the current whipping around her. He didn't look at her face as he passed. The crowd of commuters were neither loud nor quiet. Their murmurs were echoed between the droning hum of the ceiling lights and the squeak and tap of their shoes. He passed the "so tired" beam. This definitely applied to his state of being, he thought. It's a sign. He tried many alternatives. Despite his best efforts, Jeremy heard only the woman and her desperate grunting, dragging her suitcase along the floor. He shuffled on for a few steps, fighting every altruistic bone in his body. The light became stronger. He could feel too much, was connected to too much. The sounds all came in unison, threading into each other, along with the impression of some beam of violet energy burning into his back. He wouldn't be able to survive that heat for the duration of the tunnel. He turned around. He had begun to offer his help when her eyes stopped him dead. They were as violet as the blouse, perhaps more so. The needles of her irises seemed to refract the light towards the large pupils at their center, commanding attention. Her face was soft and smoothly ridged, oval-shaped, wrinkled by the years, but not at all what he had expected. He didn't know what he expected exactly, but certainly not this. He was silent for a half-second before catching himself. Sorry, I was wondering if you needed some help with your stuff. She looked at him with her burning irises. He wanted to tear away from her gaze, but thought it would cause offense. Without tilting her head, she peered at the suitcase in one hand, the tote bags in the other, and brought her eyes back level with his. Her face was placid and firm. Sure, I could use some. She was from somewhere down south. He took the suitcase from her and started off. The wheels felt jammed, so he stopped, took off his backpack, and knelt down. He was still a bit liquid-like. Pieces of wood and dirt were stuck within the hollows of the wheels. My name is Vivian, by the way, she said. He didn't look up. Oh, I'm Jeremy. Here's your problem, he said, wondering how the wood had gotten wedged in there and why she hadn't bothered to check. He took them out and tossed the little pieces to the wall. This seemed to annoy her. As he got up, he noticed one of her shoes had some name scrawled along its side. Jeremy put on his backpack, grabbed the suitcases, and continued on. He focused on the shuffling of feet in front of him to force the color of violet out of his head. Perhaps he should say something to break the ice, but it seemed too late now. To open the conversation at that point would just be awkward. They went on like this for a bit. Coming to terms with the fact that he wasn't going to, the woman spoke. So, boy, you from around here? He turned. Her face hadn't changed. At first he thought she was disrespecting him, but the tone of her voice quavered, slightly but noticeably enough, puncturing the facade. I'm from the Bronx, actually. Vivian adjusted her purse underneath her armpit. Ah, she said. She went silent for a few steps. Can't say I know much of it, except what you see in the movies. Jeremy gave a polite laugh. It's not that bad. Usually. The light continued to bombard. He fumbled with his lip. And you? He went on. Where are you from? A long way from here, she said coldly. You wouldn't know it. She paused and looked down at her shoes. I imagine living in the center of the universe makes you forget about other places. He had been startled awake that morning by a horrific stinging smell and found himself on the floor at the foot of the couch, a pool of vomit cradling his face and sticking in mucus-like strings to his cheek. The sun had already risen. The light was trying to force its way in through the corners of the blinds, breaking through in pockets. The room was suffused in an unreal atmosphere of the kind where objects will seem to unloose and float away. He did everything in his power to get up. His hands slid on the hours-old vomit, so he used his forearms to prop himself. His legs were gone. They trembled without him feeling their vibration. And with great difficulty he hobbled in fits and starts, stumbling a few times into the bedroom. He found them laying on the queen bed just as he'd left them, over the red and white striped comforter. But this time they were silent and gray-faced, statues of flesh, with dried liquid traced down the sides of their cheeks. Tanny on the left side of the bed had his eyes open, looking curiously at something out of Jeremy's range. He just stood there. In his daze, shot through with the thin indigo blades of early sunlight, he used every remaining drop of intellect to recall by force the scattered pieces of the night. He put his hand to his temple and, stepping back to sit down, half fell on his ass, leaning his head against the doorframe. It was slow at first, but the memories began to gravitate back into orbit, coming to him in a thickly compressed impressions. One of them had marveled that they were tripping harder than ever, but also feeling calmer than ever. He remembered agreeing. He suggested they go lay down like he had been doing on the couch. He remembered being engulfed by the cushions like quicksand, so full of serene joy that it felt like a beneficent sacrifice to give up a few seconds to call out, "Happy travels, my friend," to the other two, as they laughed and probably waved and went into the bedroom. He wouldn't know, since his generosity didn't extend to opening his eyes. He remembered an incredible cooling sensation. A system of soft jets were insinuating themselves into every cell of his body, obliterating every worry and fear and care he had ever had throughout the course of his short life, and sank into a warm, colorful oblivion that welcomed him, and he welcomed it back, with open arms. Then he remembered nothing else. Perhaps there was more that could have been done, but when he shook Kenny and then Daniel by the shoulders hard and got no response after a minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, he lost the little sense he'd been holding on to and slipped into hysteria. All the petty concerns of a sensible future relinquished, of dreams born and grown and suddenly taken, overcame any moral feeling. And so, in a moment he would remember as the major sin of his life, he stepped out of the bedroom, found his shoes at the side of the couch, put on his jacket with a jerking motion, and left, softly closing the door behind him. It was slow going at first, but the longer they walked down that infinite tunnel in scattered bursts on the scramble of voices enveloping them, the more freely they talked. As they passed the "Get Fired" column, Vivian, relaxing into an easier rhythm after dragging her suitcase for so long, asked him what he was doing now. "I'm in school," Jeremy answered, wiping the sweat off his forehead. He suddenly felt like he was roasting. That's nice, she said. "Where?" He told her. "Ah, that's a very good school. Congratulations, young man." "It's all right, thanks." She touched the end of her bun of black hair. "And what are you studying? What are you getting yourself into?" This was the question Jeremy hated. He had rehearsed the self-made script many times. "I thought that what I wanted to do was marketing, but after a while I realized that my heart was really telling me to," and all the rest of the preening and self-justification. But he surprised himself. Instead of giving the same old performance, he told her the truth straight. "I'm trying to become a rapper." It sounded ridiculous upon impact. "I mean," he qualified, "I already rap, but I'm trying to make a living from it," readjusting his backpack and ruffling his hair. Vivian slowed a bit, looking down at the floor, then back at him. "Good for you," she said, in a raspy voice that hinted of breaking. "Good for you." The surprise of her acceptance opened something small in him. After a few steps, he began telling her how difficult following his dream had been, how his whole family, save distant cousins, opposed it, said that he was throwing away his life on common American degeneracy. He stopped in the middle of the crowd, annoying a group of suited business types directly behind them, and got out one of the hip-hop books he'd pilfered from the school library. She looked at the cover, smiled politely, and handed it back to him. Jeremy smiled weakly back and pressed on. He looked up. "Why the pain?" the ceiling screamed at him. In his own room, he got ready like it was any other weekday. He showered, bristled under the cold water, dried himself with an undersized brown towel, and brushed his teeth so harshly that his gums bled red through the blue-white toothpaste. Vivian eventually offered bits of her own story. She had just turned 63. She was born in a little town a few miles from Oxford, Mississippi, where Faulkner had lived. She went to college for nursing before dropping out to take care of her newborn. This was her first time in New York. She had come to visit her grandson, the only child of her only child. Upon hearing this, Jeremy felt a twinge of satisfaction that her grandchild had gotten out of Mississippi and into a more cosmopolitan part of the world, and felt more comfortable around her because of that satisfaction. The violet was still pressing itself into his consciousness despite his attempts to swat it away with conversation. "Just go home! I'm trying, his spirit yelled. "Leave me alone!" "So what does your grandson do?" Jeremy asked. At this point, they had to be beyond halfway through. He tiptoed to look ahead, but still couldn't see where it was supposed to dip and veer right. The tunnel seemed to end nowhere. The light had now become oppressive over him, and the silky warmth was beginning to leave his body. He considered stopping for a breath. Carrying her suitcase along with his had been more difficult than he gambled on. She was silent for a moment and took a long breath before answering. "He's in some trouble," she said. Jeremy didn't know how to respond except to bring his lips together and nod. The whole world is in some trouble, he thought. This city will teach you that lesson every day. He wasn't. He said it unthinkingly and immediately regretted it. The words dropping out of his mouth as one of those comforting and useless platitudes people offer when faced with an absolute condition that resists all efforts to describe it. She continued on, eyes to the floor, in a dark silence. She then stopped abruptly and looked straight through his faded radiance. He turned to face her. She said, Can you resurrect the dead? Her eyes were stony and full and locked onto his. The violet was all-consuming. Nothing else existed. The known world consisted of him, her, and the supreme violet. No, ma'am, I can't. Then there's nothing you can do. After saying those words to Jeremy, the color which had surpassed and encompassed all others wrapped itself around him. It started from the soles of his shoes, which ran parallel to the name of Vivian's grandson scribbled on her old white sneakers. He turned and tried to continue walking forward, but it was no use. It slid up to his stomach and solar plexus, where it broke the glass case sitting on the horizon of his imagination, and he was finally connected to the wrenching grief that now gave him the overwhelming urge to scream, to cry out in pain for his friends, the ones he left behind like a coward, wrapping up around his neck and filling his mouth so that he couldn't say a word, couldn't spill his soul, and he looked quickly back at her with her eyes that were neither of angels nor demons. The world of violet and its sounds of lights and murmurs and squeaks and taps whirling and whirling around him. He hit the floor hard, breathing in short, desperate rasps with his vision blurred, sinking away from Vivian and the tunnel and his poem and the whole city. He kept sinking and sinking into that now freezing oblivion until he was faced with the two friends he had loved floating suspended above him, their eyes calm but burnt to deep gold, caught by the beast, their irises saying to him that his cowardice was not in vain, that there was still life yet now that he had found a new color. A crowd formed around them, and paramedics were called. Vivian walked with him beside the stretcher and into the ambulance, claiming to be his aunt. And that's it.